welcome to the IPI Virtual World Congress once again, and this is the session 15. So we are in the fourth week, 15 sessions. I think that we will end next week with more than like around over 20 sessions. So yeah, thank you very much for attending once again. And today we're going to talk about online harassment and specifically about newsrooms strategies. Newsrooms are usually the first line of defense, to protect journalists and to prevent the attacks and the impact that these online abuse and smear campaigns have on on journalists, both the emotional toll, but also professional toll as well. And this is an area where IPI has been working for like over 6 years now. We started in 2014 trying to understand first what was the issue and the scope of the phenomenon. And our work has developed into try to understand what are the most efficient measures to tackle online harassment. And we're going to be covering several topics in this session. This session is going to run for 90 minutes. And we're going to try to, first of all, understand what's the impact of online abuse in your newsrooms. How to analyze, how to do a prospect, analysis of whether your journalists are being targeted and what's the impact on their work on that. Also, how to assess the risk level and the support mechanisms that should be implemented or that should be available at least for journalists working on in your newsroom. How to moderate online abuse, social media channels, but also how to create this community that all news outlets or every news outlet is trying to nurture and to cherish. And what strategies also should be included in the protocol and the strategies to combat specific gender and racial related attacks. And we're going to do so with three panelists, three speakers, experts, and let me welcome them. Jason Reich from the New York Times Company and Vice President of Corporate Security. Hi, Jason, how are you doing?
Hi, good afternoon and good morning.
Exactly. And Viktorya Vilk, how are you?
Hi, everyone, welcome.
Viktorya Vilk is the Director of Digital Safety and Free Expression Programs at PEN America, and also Sofia Diogo Mateus from Brussels, and she's the Audience Development Editor at Politico Europe. Hello.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Javier. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. Well, first of all, before we dive in, this webinar is organized in partnership with PEN America. So I think that we wanted to do this because PEN America has been actually working a lot and has developed an extensive work and materials and products on these specific issues. So Viktorya, I don't know if you want to give us an overview.
I'll be quick. Thank you so much, Javier. It's been a real pleasure organizing this session with you and with IPI. So as Javier said, I'm the Program Director for Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America. My work focuses primarily on US-based press freedom issues with a real emphasis on online abuse and the way in which it is actually leading to self-censorship, not to mention all kinds of psychological and emotional harm to the people who have to experience it. Broadly speaking, our work falls into several different categories. We are doing research on particularly kind of technology-based solutions and sort of platform-based solutions to this issue of online abuse. We are doing trainings and workshops. We work very, very closely with newsrooms across the United States on putting policies and protocols in place that better support and protect staff. And we also build resources like our online harassment field manual, which I'll pop into the chat, which is really a kind of guide on what to do if you are facing online abuse in terms of self-care, in terms of seeking support from others, in terms of response. So those are kind of the broad areas of the work that we do, and I'll be drawing on that, as we talk today. The one thing I will kind of draw your attention to is that we are doing a whole series of free workshops and trainings all of this fall, including one tomorrow. That's a digital safety, anti-hacking, anti-doxing workshop with Freedom of the Press Foundation, and several next week and the week after. So I would just encourage you to check those out. Thank you so much, Javier.
No, it's actually a really interesting series of webinars. So I would highly encourage you to join those as well if you're really interested in this issue. And let's dive in. But before then, let me remind our audience. So first of all, this is going to be a very interactive conversation. So please just feel free to go to the chat and introduce yourself. So, for example, my name is Javier Luque, and I'm working for the International Press Institute. I'm the head of digital communications, and so this is actually me. So just feel free to do that, and also to drop your questions in the Q&A box. And we're going to be answering these questions in a rolling basis. So whenever we jump from one area to another area, we'll look into what's in the Q&A. So without further ado, let's start with, and I think that probably one of the most interesting areas, at least for me when I started, and like in 2018, IPI visited over 45 newsrooms across 5 European countries. And we wanted, and the first thing that struck me is that in many of these newsrooms, there's still a few people who believe that online harassment it's an issue that comes with the job, so that journalists should get used to it, right? So I don't know, how did you, what's been your approach, to deal with these kind of issues in your newsrooms? So let me start with Sofia, for example.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think that I think for us and for me, especially at DW and now in my new role, I was working at Deutsche Welle up to now, and that it was in that condition that I helped Javier put together the Newsrooms on the Line guide, which kind of similar but nowhere near as good as the PEN America one. So just putting that out there for Viktorya. I think a lot of it goes into making sure that people above, so management level, are aware of just how relentless being online can be for journalists, especially if that's something that they need. And so for me, a lot of it went into showcasing sheer numbers, right? Sometimes when we'd have mobbing or people would get really, really overwhelmed, I use that, unfortunately, as a way to flag it up to the higher ranks in management, be like, look, these people are dealing with hundreds, if not thousands of comments. And this today is a particularly bad case, but this builds up over time. We need to have these structures in place to facilitate and a protocol to help things work a little better and to provide them with the support that they need. I think in many ways, because I was working in Germany, it was quite easy, because I think there's a sense that certain types of violence, namely sexism and anti-Semitism, which are very common online, are illegal. And so there's a lot of sensitivity around the issue. So once some examples were also flagged up as examples of awful things that people were experiencing, we pretty quickly got support from management to put together a protocol and a couple of lines of work.
Jason.
Sure, yeah, it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and it's the hardest part of the problem is that maybe both things are true at the same time. It's not part of the job, and yet it's everywhere, and it's impacting more and more beats and fields and things that you would write about or cover. One of the points I want to make about harassment, especially the way it's played out over the past couple of years, is that in the world of journalism, there's like this field of the conflict reporter, the person who covers wars, and then there's everything else, and it's sort of like, oh well, those are the ones who go out into danger, and then everyone else is doing safe work. And now people are starting to, I think, bring that kind of thinking into newsrooms, where it's like, oh, well, if you're going to write about, I'll use an American context here, if you're going to write about QAnon or things like that, far right groups, then it's like being a war reporter. You're kind of like, you have to have a special sort of preparation or training in order to do this kind of work. And I think that that's very unhealthy, because that actually leads to the argument that you said. It's like, well, it's part of the job. You know, if you go cover a war, then danger is part of the job, and that's acceptable and that's understood. I reject the thought that, like, if you're going to write about a musician or anything else not related to armed conflict, that danger should be part of that job. The other reason, of course, is that the areas in which people tend to find themselves abused or harassed online and the topics that they cover, that range of topics is growing every day. And so it used to be much more narrow. I think it really started actually with video games and Gamergate, if people are familiar with the history, right? So it's sort of a very narrow thing where if you were going to write about this topic, you were going to be exposed to harassment. But if you were going to write about the Iraq War, President Bush, using the American context, even the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was a classic example of a very contentious issue. People could be mean, but they wouldn't have the same levels of abuse and harassment. I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago. Nowadays, if you write about Taylor Swift, you can get doxxed and abused and harassed. And so it's not the right mentality to think of it as like, oh, it's like war reporting and you have to get into the right thing. It's something that's impacting every desk and every newsroom. And so it really needs to be fundamental, our approach to addressing it.
That's a very interesting point as well, because I think that we need to also make people understand, and I'm sure that part of our audience, we have like your managers and editors, but also journalists, that one thing is this individual attack that just one person wakes up, you know, in the morning just feeling, oh no, I want to vent, and then just turn to their screen to target a specific journalist, you know. That's one thing. The other thing is when we talk about organized attacks, right? So we have state actors having, you know, trying to control the narrative of any given, you know, circumstances or event in the country, and they turn to either silence, you know, journalists through intimidation campaigns. We're talking about a coordinated attack where, you know, there's not only attacks on social media, but also we have smear campaigns being posted in these news sites, like articles attacking the credibility of the journalists, right? So that's why I think it's important for all the journalists, you know, work in the newsrooms, but also for freelancers, right? Working in a more isolated environment from home or from, you know, like different locations, to feel that in the newsrooms there is a conducive environment for them to come forward and talk to their editor, right? That and by reporting a specific attack, or by saying, look, listen, I don't feel, or like I'm feeling sad or depressed, or I think that this is having an impact on me, you know, I'm not less of a journalist. So there's no stigmatization on that. I don't know what's your approach, Viktorya, because while you were doing these workshops in newsrooms, right?
I think the first, probably the most important thing to start with is to acknowledge, as an institution, over and over again in all kinds of different settings, that you believe as an institution online harassment is a real problem that has serious consequences on people's personal and professional lives. And I mean, like, at all staff meetings, at like check-ins between editors and managers and their staff or freelancers, in email communications. You know, we actually are fighting against a decades-old, if not century-old, culture of sometimes machismo, frankly. You know, like, there is a sense that you're supposed to have a thick skin, nothing is supposed to get between you and your work, you know, and that's definitely, I think, been an issue in conflict reporting, although I feel like people have started talking about it. It's just even harder when you're dealing with, it's like coming through your computer or your phone, right? And there isn't necessarily a perception, as Jason said, that is a dangerous space or could be a space that causes you trauma. And so I think acknowledging the harm is the first step. I often recommend newsrooms do some kind of like survey, which is actually something Jason taught me when we first started talking about this, is some kind of anonymous survey of staff, just to get a feel for the volume of the problem internally and what people are facing and what they need. And I would also say that creating policies, protocols, and offering resources from leadership down is a very good signal that you take something seriously and that people can come forward, right? Like, if there's nothing in place, there's a perception that nobody thinks it's a serious problem and it doesn't actually need to be addressed in any way. So those are the places I usually start in conversations with newsroom leaders. I really think some of that stuff has to be modeled at and set up at the top, and then kind of permeate all the way through, so that people feel that if they went to a senior leader in a newsroom, they would not be dismissed, they would not be mocked, they would not be told to get over it, but in fact would be taken seriously and offered some kind of support.
How do you deal with, or how do you try to create this environment, this encouraging environment for journalists, Sofia? Now you've recently moved to Politico Europe, but also maybe you can talk as well about your experience in Deutsche Welle.
So I think I can't echo enough what Viktorya just said. And I think for me, in my previous position and in this one, the most important thing is that every time I talk to anyone, especially on my end, so in the audience side, anyone we recruit, anyone we are training and preparing, we both prepare them for the fact that unfortunately there will be a level of harassment, or at least not pleasant comments to look at, but also lay out everything that is available to them in terms of mechanisms and support systems and how they can talk to us and everything that is in place. So every time there's a bigger issue or a bigger story, we bring back to these, and I proactively contact all my staff members and would be like, are you okay? Do you need to take a break? Are you feeling okay? Are the comments too much? Do you need help? And in that, I found in the last 2-3 years that really is conducive to having staff come up to you and be like, look, I'm getting a lot of email, or I'm getting a lot of comments, or I'm really not able to cope with this. Can we find someone to replace me? I need to take a couple of days off. And there were never on our end any questions asked. So if someone flagged this and said that they wanted to take a couple of days off, they would. If they said they were struggling, be like, do you want to talk? Do you want us to get you help specifically? Do you want to just have a chat with me? We tried to have both levels, a formal and an informal level, because we found that some people really did not like the idea of being, and I think there were some cultural elements at play. So for context, Deutsche Welle has about 30 languages. And so there were a lot of different cultures and cultural contexts in which we had to be careful. And I'd be like, would you want to have a coffee? Would you want to go for a walk and we can just talk about it? Would you just want to go home and take some time off? So, and after a while, if I saw it being critical, I would quietly suggest, maybe you want to talk to an expert about what you're feeling. And if these things that you're feeling are happening over and over again, you want to maybe get some help. Your job will be here. It'll have absolutely no consequences. You don't have to tell us if you're doing it. We're just worried about it. And we want to make sure that you're getting as much support as possible. So I really can't echo Viktorya's words enough, right? I brought it up to our bosses. We created a protocol. And from then we made sure that everyone knew who to contact and to flag up that at any given point. And also to have the feeling that they could without it ever being underestimated or considered something minor or expected to come with a job.
That's actually a very important point that you made this, right? So that you have these formal mechanisms, these formal ways to entry like a report, like an abuse, etc., an attack, and then there's these informal measures as well. That those are as important as the formal ones, because those are the ones that actually give journalists working in a newsroom the feeling that there's an interest about talking about that and makes it normal to come forward, right? I don't know, Jason, what's your experience in the New York Times?
Well, we when I speak on this issue, I actually tend to and Viktorya knows because we've done a lot of these together. I actually think that the best example comes out of Reuters, and there's a few other organizations that have put together peer support networks that are really well fleshed out. They're managed by a third party vendor that provides like the professional underpinning and the that provides the regulatory structure for which this kind of work can happen in a lot of larger newsrooms. It can be very difficult to simply say, let's get a peer support network to have journalists talk to each other and work through this. At the same, so I'm going to point to them as an example of where it's been done right. It is not yet in place at a place like the New York Times or at other places that I've worked, because it's really hard to do. On the flip side of that, one of the challenges is that your traditional, in the United States, it's called the Employee Assistance Program, an EAP, or in Europe, this would be like the mental health resources that would be available to any employee of any company, through health insurance or through through a national health insurance program. The problem with these things is that these resources are really not geared towards the specific issue of online harassment or abuse. The resources are sort of much more general. These are resources for people who are struggling in their lives in a host of different ways. And we found, and the research can back it up, that they're just not used in this kind. People don't use these things for help when it comes to online abuse and harassment. They don't turn to their company's mental health resources because those resources are not oriented towards this specific problem. What people do want is they want to talk to colleagues and others who've been through this before. So establishing those peer support systems is really important. I'll put one more beat on to talk a little bit about the New York Times and a little bit about the philosophy of trying to create what culture are we trying to foster. And the word that I always push is the word resilience. It is really important, and I'm sure some questions will come up about this, and we can talk a lot about this idea throughout this session. But we are First Amendment organizations. We're all news organizations here, right? Or we're media organizations, and we cannot be in the business of going on offense. I always say we play defense, we don't play offense. We can't be part of a group that's trying to ban or remove the speech of others, even if, and obviously there's exceptions, but even if these are groups that are harassing or doing things like that. So when we look at our approach and our philosophy as to how are we going to confront this issue, we think about playing defense. We think about how can we foster resilience of our staff, because we know that the harassment is going to come. And instead of saying, well, we're going to use our institutional power to sort of attack them back, which is rarely the right thing to do, we think about how we can create an environment where our staff feels supported and feels protected, so that when it comes, the best case scenario, I know it's not always, the best case scenario is that they can brush it off their shoulder and get back to work without having to worry about it. And that's sort of the goal that we're trying to move towards, instead of thinking, oh, who hurt you and how can we attack them back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Viktorya, what's your experience with newsrooms? Have any of them, the one that you've been working on in the US, and giving as well the amount of online abuse that comes towards journalists, given the polarization of the country right now. I don't know how these organizations deal with these the potential emotional impact and professional impact on the journalists.
Sorry, Javier, just to clarify, are you asking kind of what are some of the things I've seen newsrooms start to put in place to better deal with abuse?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So I think of things sort of in several different buckets at the institutional level, right? I'm not talking at interpersonal, but at the institutional level, I think acknowledging harm is literally the first place to start. If people don't feel comfortable coming forward, or they think they'll be dismissed, or there'll be negative professional consequences for coming forward, that's why I'm glad you started with that question, because that's the very first step. I think institutional policy that basically states very clearly where your institution stands on online harassment, including some of the nuances that Jason is raising. But also a protocol, which is more practical than a policy. A protocol is like, when I'm in the middle of a horrific Twitter storm, what do I do? Who do I turn to? Like, do I report it somewhere internally? Is there someone I can go talk to? Is it my manager? Is it HR? Is there an email account or a Slack channel I can inform? And then someone will get back to me with some kind of resources or support. So a protocol, but the protocol also has to be for managers, because sometimes managers don't know how to be supportive in the right way, or they freeze and they don't know what to do when they're confronted with someone who is really traumatized or really stressed and overwhelmed. And so a protocol that gives some guidance for someone on the receiving end, a target, and some guidance for the person who is trying to talk to them about it is a really good place to start. Jason talked about peer support networks. It's true that I think Reuters is really the gold standard for that, and I have worked with them closely. I think it's fantastic. I can talk more about it later if we want. Where I would push back a little bit against Jason is resilience is great. I'm also a firm believer in resilience. I think that people on the receiving end of a great deal of online abuse sometimes feel like resilience is used as a kind of way of saying, like, the onus is mostly on you to deal with this. But I know Jason well enough to know that that's not what Jason's talking about. So I think it's worth clarifying. To my mind, it's true that the New York Times should not be trying to like crush the speech of everyone on the internet, but I do think that the New York Times and every other newsroom should be offering training proactively to help people stave off some of the kinds of online abuse that they might experience. So there are things you can do to protect yourself from doxing. There are things you can do to protect yourself from hacking. Like, there are concrete steps you can take to protect yourself proactively. That won't make some of the insults and the other stuff go away, but it might make you feel physically safer and mentally more kind of in control of what's happening to your life. And so I think there are ways that you can tackle some of this stuff proactively. And I think the reactive part of it that a lot of newsrooms have still not figured out is the comment moderation. And I mean, of course, on the bottoms of articles, but I'm also talking about social media channels that are institutional social media channels. And there, I think, is maybe where some of us might disagree, but I really feel like really robust, effective content moderation is really, really important, because it signals to your reporters, to your sources, to everyone else that you take harassment seriously and that you won't let anything go on your platform. So like, if your reporter is getting doxxed, or your reporter is getting, you know, hate speech lobbed at them every other day at the bottom of every article they write, there are ways to deal with that, and not very few institutions are doing that effectively right now. So that's where I think we get into some of the thornier things, which I'm always happy to talk about.
Yes, and basically you've just given an overview of the topics and the areas that we're going to cover, which is absolutely great. And we've been talking this for so many times, that your work and your diagnosis in the US, it's pretty similar to the work and diagnosis, you know, that we've done here in Europe, and most of the protocols and measures that we try to promote among newsrooms are also similar. So Jason, I don't know if you want to clarify what Viktorya mentioned there.
Sure. Yeah. It's always good to sort of like dive right into where there's no easy answers and things are tough, right? And you know, I deal with this every day on a practical level. You know, a reporter could come to me and say, this person is bothering me online. Can we do something about it? You know, and we sort of have to address, well, is the question legitimate? What does it look like? How do we make sure this person feels supported at the same time? It's never the same answer every time. Certainly, you know, Viktorya's point about organizations not having a great institutional record is 100% accurate. The hardest part here, and I'm going to ask a question, like this isn't the answer, but rather I'm going to throw a question back at you and to the whole group. It's the area that's so difficult, is, and one that we've grappled with a lot, is to not respond proactively, to not fight back, is both a tactic and also a strategy, if that makes sense, right? So it's to say that the strategy is, as I said earlier, this very lofty idea, we're a First Amendment organization, we don't fight back, we take it, and blah, blah. But there's also a tactic, which is when trolls are attacking you, to give them more attention can kind of make it worse sometimes. The most challenging part is to try and explain to a journalist who's being attacked that says, the reason why we think you shouldn't respond is not because we're trying to protect, you know, the company as opposed to you, but actually it's better for you. So, or to say our interests are aligned here, which is by not going on the offense, by not replying to these trolls, by not like doing something, it's actually better it's better for you in a small tactical sense. sometimes it diverges. And then sometimes, I should say, it is right for an organization to go out and proactively say something when someone is being attacked. And you, Javier, you brought up that sometimes it's not like a random troll, just some nobody, but it's actually an organization, or it's actually something that could be a state-sponsored attack or something like that. And in that case, I think that the balance of power perhaps indicates that maybe there is a point to be more proactive and to make a statement and to do something. So the reason I introduced that thought, and I'll keep it there in the beginning, is in the discourse, there are other organizations that are trying to tackle this problem, non-media organizations, and their approach in the United States has really been focused on creating laws that will make harassment more dangerous, which is to say, can we find laws that make it so that if you did harassment, it would be more illegal. And I know that in Europe, there are a lot more laws that exist like that, hate speech laws and such. In the United States context, a media organization cannot be on that side. And so we have to figure out how to try to solve this problem without putting ourselves sort of attached to that movement, even if that movement is doing good work, and even if that, and even if we're kind of aligned, we're kind of allied with some of those people, we can't go as far as them because as everyone here knows, if you make too many laws against speech, they'll come back and be used against us.
Yeah, no, and I agree as well here, because there's also a problem with the perception of the audience eventually when you as an organization try to attack, because these kind of organized attacks usually come through proxies, right? And so if the New York Times or Politico or any other organization, BBC, etc., just releases a statement against a specific, even if they're not mentioning it, but against a specific list of users, then there must be, it can be dangerously perceived as a asymmetry between, the two actors involved in here, right? Yeah, no, I was thinking about this, and then we can jump in directly into the social media and comments and so on. But I think that also the way that I understood, and please, Viktorya, correct me if I'm mistaken, is that there are certain things that newsrooms can do, to enhance the resilience and to protect certain, to protect their journalists from these attacks, like you were mentioning about training, different things. And I remember talking to several newsrooms in Finland with the Helsinki Sanomat, for example. We discussed the possibility of having a workshop, specifically workshop like 1 hour and a half, 2 hours, for new journalists coming into the newsrooms, but also, journalists who have, like, seasoned journalists there, to have a workshop with one of the journalists who have been heavily targeted with online harassment, exposes their case, and the newsroom there just also explains what are the protocols and what are the measures that can be taken, right? So more on a case basis. Yeah, so I wanted to ask Sofia also to try to talk about this social media. How do you respond to these kind of attacks?
I mean, I think Jason's point is really interesting because I do think that there's a little bit of a disparity in the way things are approached, maybe in the US versus Europe, but also perhaps I would say, and pardon me for lack of a better expression, the Anglo world versus other maybe more continental traditions. Again, all of this very much between brackets, as for lack of better terms. So for us as a company at DW, where we experienced a lot of different types of attacks from targeted against our journalists, but also against our coverage and our accounts, we did come up with a level at which we would respond and we would moderate the comments, right? There were levels at which we thought, right, this is too much, and we're going to try to at least showcase in some way that we're not okay with some of the stuff happening here. Now, this is less of a science and more of an art form, because like Jason said, there's a lot to be said about amplification. And I think that that was always my concern when training people for this. Like there needs to be a threshold after which we think that we intervening makes sense. And I mean on the corporate accounts, not on a personal level. And all of this now is about corporate accounts. I'll then talk about our personal approaches, as in for staff members. When we, for example, at times got mobbed with claims that what we were saying was not true, and it was fake news, and a few times it happened in the hundreds, almost thousands. And it was very clear that it wasn't just random users by the pattern, the speed at which it was happening. We would often not ever ban anything, but we would answer, for example, in the comments of our social media account saying, we have covered this issue extensively with this and this and that, and we've covered the other side of the conflict or of the argument and blah, 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 blah. So we would be more a way to kind of stand up for what we thought was an abuse of whatever we were putting together. If we thought the level of mobbing was necessary. For the personal side of things, we did have a protocol after which we told our, first we took our staff offline and we advised that they would leave the internet and not look at the comments on their accounts if they were being mobbed to a level that we thought was just not something that they should be dealing with. We would offer help from our end, from the social media team, to look at those comments so that they wouldn't. And then we'd do an assessment, right? And if we thought that those posed a threat to their personal safety, we'd flag it up to our security team to make sure that those people were being, taken care of in the way that we thought appropriate. In addition to that, for a lot of more high visibility staff, and I was arguing, and I should say no corporate reality is perfect. I argued for an overall training, but we only had this for people who had the most visibility. In our case, people who were on television and so were the faces and were often seen, and their accounts often had a lot of attention. We had very basic social media training in the sense of, please don't. Make sure that your accounts are secure and safe. So two-step authentication, everything that you can have that can make it harder for someone to dox you or to get into your account, do that. Don't ever put any sort of information that could highlight exactly where you are. It could make it easier for you to be found. Could make it easier for you to be threatened physically or found physically. And then we had a small training about how to handle, like Viktorya said, some of the level of abuse. I do believe in resilience as well, and we believed in resilience, but I think it's a hard balance to find, because we did see some people feel very attacked. Some people just would brush it off and it was like nothing had ever happened, and they just seem to have an amazing ability to just like not, at least to us, never mention any sort of like genuine personal impact, but others really like doubted themselves. And so we tried very much to come up with a way to give them a sense of, try to react to this in a way that is fair to how you're feeling, right? We were very, very keen on not letting any correspondent or any journalist who was quite visible feel like they had to just carry on if there was a stage at which they couldn't or felt like they weren't equipped to. So due to sometimes our inability to stop certain things, because sometimes you just can't. And sometimes when we saw that being, that didn't happen too often, but a few times we had it where we thought that it was coordinated. We did put out, not on social, but we did mention it on a corporate level. But for the most part, we often would just you know, without any sort of issues to their careers, if people wanted to and were willing to, would maybe take them offline for a little bit.
Yeah, also to remind all our experts, Viktorya, Sofia, and Jason, that also feel free to jump in into, you know, to the other words and so on. So, yeah, no, Jason, let us walk us through the protocol of a journalist who's being, you know, targeted, for example, with some harassment and
Sure.
wants to show, support.
Well, we're lucky that there's, you know, this is a well-resourced newsroom, and we have a team of, you know, security professionals that can respond rapidly. One thing I would promote, and this is doesn't cost anything, and something that we've instituted at the Times, and I know a lot of other places it's very successful, is what I call a single contact culture for security. I imagine that who's responsible for handling for responding to issues of online harassment at a given company? Is it a dedicated security team? Is it like the IT team? Is it legal? Is it comms? It can be is it human resources? It can be any of the above, right? What I would advise is choosing the employee, like don't leave it to the employee to have to figure out who is the right person to try to help answer the question. Create what's called a single contact culture. So for example, we have one security email, very easy to remember, and it's for any problem. You know, if you lost your badge to get into the building, you can email it. If you are going to go to do a dangerous assignment in a hostile part of the world, you can email it. And if you're being harassed online, you can email it. And now on the back end, I would, if, you know, just to get into the specifics of the operational details, I would advise people use some form of a ticketing solution. There's a lot of vendors out there that make them, you know, that helps you triage behind the scenes, right? If the volume is very high, and again, at a company as large as ours, we're fielding, you know, hundreds of emails, right, all the time, but we're able to parse it out and respond to it. But the most important thing is, and Viktorya said this right at the beginning, it's like you have to create the culture of somebody being able to ask for help and know, right? So how do they know to ask for help? So my first mission is to make sure that if someone is being harassed, that they know that there's help available and they know how to do it. And that's just by sending off this email. The other thing that I say, and we do this in all of our communications, is we make it very clear that there isn't a specific definition of threats, abuse, or harassment, which is what I mean is there's no bar. And it's like, if it's under the bar, please don't bother us. And then if it's over the bar, then you can talk to us, because everyone's bar is in a different place. And how do you convince someone, you know, what the bar is? So we always say in all of our communications, there's no bar. If something makes you uncomfortable, not just for you, if you witness something happening online that's targeting somebody else, please let us know about it. You know, we're well staffed. We can address it. Just email this address and we'll look at it. So let's say somebody then emails that address. The next most important thing, and this is something that a lot of organizations have learned the hard way, and so I'm really will like give a very, very specific didactic answer here. Do not set up this email thing with an auto response, or if you need an auto response, have the auto response say a person is going to get in touch with you soon, and make sure that a real person writes back to them. And you don't need to have all the answers, and you don't need to know like what it is or even have looked at it. You just need to say like, hey, Viktorya, this is Jason from the security team. Got your email. I'm taking a look, you know, because when somebody's experiencing harassment, you know, it could be nothing or it could be something. And I understand the temptation on the part of a legal team or a human resources team or a security team to say like, I don't want to talk until I know what's going on and until I have all the answers. But most of the time, that person just wants to know that like someone else is going to be there and doing something. So the most important thing is, and we actually set a limit for ourselves. We try to get a response within the hour. And if your organization is small enough, I would set yourself an even smaller time scale, right? Get a response to that person within 30 minutes that just says, hey, got your email. Let me take a look. And then of course you've created some time. The next piece is, again, when there's protocols, and don't get me wrong, we have a large team, so there's many, many, many protocols, but we try to keep those protocols invisible. Or another way of saying this is we try to keep the experience and the process as human as possible. And so it's just two people talking and working through, right? You just want to connect and have a human element because that's such an important component of the response. And so of course, the security person who's responding has been trained and has a protocol that they're following. But as much as we can do it, we try not to make it seem like they're reading off a list or that someone's filling out like a checkbox that's like, did they dox you? Yes or no? Do you have this? Do you have two-factor? Yes or no? It's like, you know, if someone's just being harassed and it's sexual in nature, it's vulgar in nature, like, you know, they would just want to have a communication with someone who can sort of recognize and understand that and make sure by going through the checklist that they're safe, but that it doesn't feel like it's a box ticking exercise. So that's sort of, I gave really the A to Z, I think, in some ways, and there's a lot more, obviously, of complexities, but those are what I would kind of point out as like the keynotes for any organization to kind of create some process for that.
Sorry, but I think that you mentioned a couple of good points, and for me the most important one is the resources, right? Because unfortunately not all the newsrooms can have the resources of the New York Times or Deutsche Welle and Politico, right? So I don't know, Viktorya, in your work with newsrooms and with journalists, have you found yourself working with newsrooms with like smaller news outlets, right? That sometimes because we did actually find cases where the editor is at the same time the manager, but also sometimes a social media moderator or not, and so there are like 5, 6, 7 people in the room. What sort of measures or strategies, you know, these newsrooms can implement?
I mean, it's true that it's really great to be as well resourced as some of the larger organizations, but most of the newsrooms I've worked with are not necessarily in that boat. And honestly, some of the stuff is still the same in the sense that you still want to have some kind of internal reporting system. Maybe it's not a complex ticketed system, maybe it's a Slack channel or like a private email, or maybe so that the burden doesn't fall on one person, there are 3 people that are always checking that email account. And maybe you do actually have to be clear to people about, you know, these are the kinds of things that rise to the level that we think we can help. Honestly, ideally not. I think I emphatically second everything Jason said about trying to make people feel like they can come to you no matter what, because you can over time kind of have a interaction where people learn like, okay, this is something that someone can help me with. This is probably something they can't, but at least I know who I can talk to. Peer support networks are not really resource dependent. You don't have to have them run by another organization. Like they can just be informal coffee chats that people, you know, have, or Zoom chats now that people have. And there are a lot of like very subsidized or free trainings and resources that are now available from IPI, from us, from other folks. So there are ways to do this, even if you're very resource constrained. I also just feel like, I don't know, so Jason and I've talked about this a lot. So much of this stuff is psychosocial support, just making sure that people do not feel completely alone, right? Because sometimes so much of this is about power dynamics, like imbalances of power. If you are a reporter, right, especially if you work for a newsroom that is quite small, and you are being attacked by the sort of tens or hundreds of thousands of messages, you will feel completely sort of outnumbered and overwhelmed. But if you have an institution behind you, you have colleagues behind you, you have people who have your back, that shifts the balance of power a little bit, and it feels less scary and less like you're just dangling out there on your own. And so that can happen in any size newsroom, knowing that your colleagues and your boss have your back. They may have your back publicly, they may have your back privately, but you're not alone. And I think that's why creating that space where people can talk about what's happening to them and not be mocked or dismissed is actually the most important thing and the least dependent on resources in a way, I guess, is what I would say. And truly, like I've worked with several organizations to put in place like very simple internal reporting mechanisms, less complicated than what Jason's talking about because of resource limitations. And I've been surprised at how fine those have been going, in the sense that like they're not getting 500 emails an hour. People email when they get really, really concerned about something, and then there's an internal conversation, and that was happening anyway. It's just that there were no protocols. So everybody was confused. They didn't know who to turn to. Now they know who to turn to. where to go. And that makes all the difference in terms of people feeling a little bit reassured and there being some kind of clarity in the process. That was a little bit of a winding answer, but sorry.
No. But I mean, what we found as well is that in many of the newsrooms, journalists would not go to their editor, to report a case just because it's only in very extreme cases when they emotionally cannot cope with that anymore. That's when people usually react, and that goes back to what we said at the beginning, right? Maybe journalists shouldn't reach the level to, come forward and talk about it. So if editors, managers, and the newsroom per se, also colleagues, create this culture, this safety culture in the newsroom, right? Maybe there would be a lot of these emotional tolls, emotional, impact, mental health, on the journalists could be completely avoided. I think that Jason, you wanted to answer a question, right? From our Q&A box.
Yeah, well, I did actually. I typed in a few, and the joke is that, like, I wish any of us had an answer to this. It is, yes, there is really, I don't know what state institutions could do to help on this problem, and I'm not counting on them. And then I gave a much more small and particular answer, again, very much in American context. But if people aren't familiar, there exists these data brokers all over the United States where I can just go online and I could type in Viktorya's name and I find her home address, phone number, anything. Obviously in Europe, the privacy laws are substantially better. And in a lot of Asia and the Middle East, the privacy laws are substantially better, or these things don't exist. However, I also know in some Scandinavian countries, it's actually part of the government transparency that this information is there. Again, just another example of where important transparency laws rub up against security and privacy issues. And so I think that, my wish would be for a very clever policy that knows how to navigate those things, but also the real answer is I don't expect that anyone's going to come up with a clever policy like that, and so I'm not going to rely. Certainly, as I'm sure all of our international guests on this call would know, I wouldn't rely on the United States government right now to do anything coherent when it comes to coming up with policies to protect the press. So I think that we would be really we're looking at this as very much something we're trying to figure out internally.
I'm very happy to speak to the German case where there is a law. So the German reality, which is no longer my reality, but the one that I worked in for 6.5 years, is quite different. And actually in my answer before, I guess maybe I didn't go too much into that, in the sense that our concern with comment moderation at Deutsche Welle was also because, legally speaking, after a certain threshold, we might be held liable for certain comments on our platforms and Facebook pages and websites, right? So our concern with making sure that the debate stayed within a reasonable level was also of interest to us, legally speaking. Coming back to that, in Germany, there's a law that mandates that social media companies need to take down, it's called NetzDG or NetzDG, and it mandates that social media companies have to take down certain types of comments within 72 hours or face quite heavy fines. That law is being revised as we speak. I'd say that it's a very mixed bag. It's helped in that you can see that certain barrages of comments have disappeared or disappear quite quickly. But what we've also seen is that some comments that may use certain words that the systems that Facebook, Twitter, and so on have put in place to automatically detect that kind of speech, but those comments might not necessarily fall within that, or might be calling out people who are doing or saying these things, or might be advocating for certain things. Those comments also may disappear. So it's very difficult to speak and say NetzDG is an example that everyone should emulate, especially because it's been criticized by a lot of people in Germany and outside as being partially unconstitutional, overreaching. And so I would say that that's an area where the, and also the mechanism and the reporting mechanism that they put together for the social media platforms is woefully inadequate, because both Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube give a report of how many takedowns they have done, but they don't actually do any sort of analysis or provide any sort of content for analysis of what exactly is happening in those takedowns, which is highly problematic because I saw comments disappear from my pages that were not comments that should have been taken down, and I had no way of getting them back, if you know what I mean. I did flag it up to them a few times, like, look, whatever you're doing, you're overreaching. Maybe you need to have someone go over the automatic takedowns, which they won't, because comment moderation is one of those things that big social media platforms outsource. So I would be, there's a few articles about this. If people would want them, I'm happy, in academic studies as well, I'm happy to share them. But unfortunately, like Jason said, it's not a clear one-stop solution, silver bullet that is going to solve all of these issues. No way. And the experiment that I had the pleasure of seeing in Germany very much showcased to me just how complex it is, even with the technology that we have, to come up with something that will just kind of make all of this magically okay.
Yeah, so at this point, it's almost 6 o'clock here in Central European summertime. So basically what I mean is that we have around 30 minutes left. And at this point, if any of our participants, and I know that some of them have been just checking the list of attendees, some of them have also worked extensively on these issues. And we were talking about the reaction of the support mechanisms from institutions as well. So if they want to jump in and also share their experience, you know, with us, just write it down in the chat. And Milica who is running the session behind the scenes, will actually open your mic, and also, if you feel comfortable as well, your camera, so you can share also your experience with us. That I'm sure that we are here to learn a lot as well from all of you. Let me just go quickly to one of the other areas while we wait for more questions, which is I think that one of the key issues, right, in any protocol, which is how to assess the risk level of a threat, because based on that assessment, then you direct to the journalists or towards one specific, you know, supportive measures or to another, right? So and from our point of view, there are like maybe like 3 different type of assessments, right? Like the assessment on the emotional impact and the toll that it takes on the journalists, but also whether these attacks have been, you know, somehow hampering the ability of the journalists to cover certain topics, because there's certain cases journalists decide to at least not touch upon a topic for a while, and also the credibility of the journalists and the news organization can be at stake, right? So I don't know how you deal with. So what sort of criteria do you use? And also, if you have this different level of risk assessment as well. We're talking about safety, physical safety as well, right? And digital security. I don't know, Jason, if you want to go in with this.
Sure. I want to maybe say another kind of provocative idea that doesn't have a straight answer yet, but maybe goes against the grain of a lot of what we've been saying, including what I've been saying. It's something I'm grappling with right now. We started this conversation off with this idea that, like, it's not part of the job, right? And we want to understand that it's not okay. I think that creates that begs the question. So are there some topics that, like, you know, that we should encourage journalists to do all the work that they want to do? And the answer is, of course, yes. And the way I interpret my job, and I'm sure that I think all of us, IPI, PEN America, what we're here to do is to get as many things out of the way so that journalists can do their jobs and cover, you know, what they need to cover without fear or favor, as they say, right? One thing that I'm concerned about is that we might be moving in a direction where, like I said earlier with the war reporters, where we create an environment where the harassment can have a greater impact because of the reputation that it has. So, and I'll try to say that another way. You know, if somebody is going to write a story about, let's say, far-right movements right now, it's kind of known and understood that these are groups that can do attacks online, and that there can be a lot of harassment. And what I'm really worried about is that we actually might be contributing to an undercurrent of fear among journalists that are like, oh, I'm not gonna, like, please don't ask me to write about these kinds of things. I don't want to do this kind of stuff. You know, if there's an assignment that has to deal with covering a certain topic, like, I don't want to do that. And I think that's really dangerous for journalism. We can't have it be that the only people that want to cover, you know, far right movements or other, you know, issues are ones that, like, I don't know, have the stomach for it, I guess, is like, that's not the right arrangement. That kind of brings us all the way back to the beginning, which says, oh, well, I guess it means it is part of the job, right? And so when we're talking about assessment, I think that it's really important to make a very clear distinction between what is an actual security risk, which absolutely needs to be addressed, right, immediately and very seriously and very directly, and some of the other areas, the reputational and the other ones that you described. So I don't have a good answer to it, but I want to say that that while we're pushing to have harassment taken more seriously, and while we're pushing to have these issues taken more seriously, I want to at least draw out that there is this that there is another area that we want to be conscious of, that if we push it too far, then we might actually make people more afraid to do journalism. To get more specific about, like, actually doing a threat assessment, as I said before, I think that the security, the physical safety component has a very strong influence on the other pieces, on the emotional impact and some of the others. It's not the only one. So obviously there can be a very strong emotional impact even if there is no physical safety issue, but it's certainly one of the biggest. So if you can identify or sort of clear an issue of having a security risk and saying, this is really nasty, but this person isn't going to hurt you, or they can't hurt you, right? Which is more important to say, then you've done a lot already. And then it makes your job a little bit easier as far as trying to address the emotional impact of which, and I'm sure Sofia and Viktorya have a lot of good approaches there. I won't take up all the time talking about those. I'll talk about the physical safety side of it. You really just want to be able to identify, like, is this something we need to be worried about or not? The key tip that I'll give in this area is if you do not have an in-house security team, I wouldn't just go to the police every time wherever you live, because what you really need is you need to have a context around which the harassment comes in, which means you want to be able to see all of it. You need an individual or a team that can see kind of all of the harassment over time and not just one isolated item. So if anyone on this call was going to be like, Jason, what do you think of this tweet that somebody sent to me? With all of my years of expertise, I wouldn't be able to help you because I actually don't know the context that you're seeing it in. So the one important thing I would advise for everyone who's listening is, if you're trying to stand up a program on how to assess threats, you can't just shoot it off to someone else who's never looked at everything else before. You need to pick a group, or you're going to hire someone, or you're going to outsource it to the police, but at least make sure that you get, like, the same detective and that they're the same person who's going to work with you every single time, because you can't do a meaningful threat assessment unless you actually look at multiple threats over a period of time. But yeah, for the emotional stuff and others, I'll definitely turn it to Viktorya or Sofia on their approaches.
Yeah. Also, just quickly before Viktorya and Sofia, because I want both of you to weigh in as well, both Sofia and Viktorya, and of course, Jason, you're also invited to weigh about the viciousness that attacks targeting women journalists, but also certain racial, related attacks. And because it carries, like an extra weight, an extra layer of hate and can actually be derived. And there are some cases where the amount of gender abuse towards a journalist, has derived into a PTSD, diagnosis as well and symptoms. So yeah, go ahead, Sofia, Victoria.
You want us to talk about the kind of disproportionate impact of online abuse?
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, and also how all this actually takes, you know, how also people should consider these type of attacks within the criteria, within this risk assessment.
Sure. I do want to address something that Jason said, because I thought it was not actually that provocative and very smart and quite compelling, which is that I think it's true that we don't want to scare people out of doing their jobs. I think that we as like experts and newsroom leaders run the risk of doing that less than the actual white supremacists and kind of crazy people all over the internet. But to my mind, the counter to that is providing people as much support as you can manage institutionally in terms of your financial or other restrictions, right? Like the more support you provide people, the less alone they feel, the less they feel like they are one against a million, the less likely they are to feel so intimidated that their speech is silenced or repressed. I don't think acknowledging that this is real and that it's happening is what's going to scare people out of journalism. I do think that when people feel completely alone and they think the whole thing is their fault is when they start retreating into their own kind of, retreating from the work that they want to do. And I think that I answer that because I think that's directly relevant to the question that Javier just posed. And so every newsroom that I have been to, I have seen, and I have not found a better word for this, so please excuse me because it's not a good word, but I haven't found a better one. I have seen people who are what I would call super targets. They are people who are just, everyone in the newsroom knows who they are. They are people who are dealing with the most extreme, the most relentless, perpetual, constant online harassment. They are almost always in the US, women of color. That's not always the case. There are exceptions, obviously people covering white supremacy, people doing certain kind of beats, sometimes people writing about makeup, you never know. But over and over again, you're seeing female journalists of color, non-binary journalists of color being targeted at extremely disproportionate rates to their colleagues. And I would say in those cases, those are the folks, if you have limited resources and you don't know where to start, those are the folks to start helping first, right? Make sure that those folks have as much targeted, concrete, specific support and places they can go for help as possible. Because people talk to each other in a newsroom, right? And they see how their colleagues are being treated. And so oftentimes people will ad hoc find ways to support each other, but that's not enough. And what I mean, like, I can get real concrete. Like, I mean things like making sure people have access to affordable mental health care. And if they have reservations about it, because through the institution, finding ways to alleviate those reservations or make it as easy to access as possible. Making sure people have access to legal counsel, even if it's purely just for mental sort of peace of mind. They want to talk through with the legal counsel if there's any legal recourse, and probably the legal counsel will say no. But the fact that they check that avenue and we're like, okay, that's not a way I can go forward, fine. Escalating with platforms when you have a sort of really egregious episode of abuse and you have impersonation accounts flying around, nobody can get those taken down. Having a direct contact at a platform and escalating on behalf of the people who are having really, really extreme abuse all the time. There are very concrete things. And I think Sofia talked about, which I think is marvelous, occasionally giving people a break from their own social media platforms and monitoring for them, documenting for them, threat assessing for them. All of that stuff helps actually outweigh this risk, that very real risk that Jason is talking about, which is that online abuse is in fact, we have multiple statistics now, is in fact chilling people's speech and actually changing what journalists write about, how they write about it. And the reason it matters in terms of who is disproportionately being targeted is that if we're trying to have serious conversations in the US, and I know that this is happening in Europe too and elsewhere, about having newsrooms that are more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive, if you're not helping the people who are disproportionately being attacked, you can't meaningfully create a more inclusive or diverse or equitable newsroom, because the people who are disproportionately being attacked are going to get shoved out of the profession or intimidated or overwhelmed or traumatized, and that takes a toll over time. So that's kind of my tried to cover multiple of the things that you asked me to address, but.
I mean, yes, I can only say that has also been true at TW, that we saw first women disproportionately being targeted by these things. And for us in the European context, also visible minorities, so people who were at DW Muslim, and openly so, and often covered that beat. For us, it was also people that covered refugees, and 2015 really stood as a before and after, where we saw sort of targeting. I stopped writing about it fairly soon after, but I did for a while, and every now and again I still touch it and I still get a lot of abuse. Nothing that compares to my colleagues that were and that are visible minorities, and openly so, right? Open minorities in the way they do their coverage. So I think that what Viktorya said is all very true. And I think that that is, that's to me was always what we wanted to make sure that people knew, that within the newsroom, it was a safe space for them to express however it was that they were feeling. Again, at DW, it's a huge company, so we had a legal department, so it's quite easy to also escalate there and to escalate to the security team if we felt that those things were necessary. So focusing only on the mental support side, often it started with just acknowledging it, right? And often proactively asking about it. And I did that, I guess in a way, I uniquely positioned to be in charge of this because I was in charge of comment moderation on our platforms during the wave of attacks in 2015 and 16, and there was no protocol for help at the time. And so I took a lot of that burden on to myself. And then when we hired more people and I started training them, I wanted to make sure that that wouldn't happen to them. So I can only really reiterate the logic of, we talk about it, we bring it up. So if there's ever any sort of moment where we've seen that they've done something and they're getting a lot of attention, or it's a news event that we know is going to bring about I call it a river of comments, sometimes more, an ocean of comments, we will ask and openly call up just the desk and whoever's on shift and be like, are you okay? Do you need backup? Do you need to change? Do you need to talk about it? Do you want to go for coffee? Do you want us to find someone to replace you next week if you want to take the week off? So in a way that we've always tried to make it very humane and not in any way sort of indicating that it's not their fault that they can't do this, but just saying, it's a lot. What you're dealing with, it's a lot. Do you need someone to talk to? Do you want to flag it up? Other than the normal protocols that are in place that you can always mention, blah, blah, blah. And I can't, this was something that I only learned last year, which Jason mentioned, the one contact point was not something that we had in place. So I'm very happy to reiterate that too, but also bring it very much like Viktorya says, to a very human, everyday colleague next door, kind of like just check in with people, try to be mindful of that kind of stuff for sort of the peer support and the psychological support, right? And so often I would also flag this up to management if I thought that someone was, maybe doing too many shifts that are bad shifts. Can we change them up to something that is a bit lighter for a couple of weeks? Like trying to be very mindful of the people who are in these positions and maybe offer them the possibility to keep on doing their job, to keep on doing it just fine, but to take a break from whatever is taxing at any given point in time, because our priority is their well-being.
Mm-hmm. So on the same line about social media and comment moderation, etc., we have two questions. One from Basilio Monteiro. Given the level of the evolution and development of social media technology, do you think is it realistic to have any meaningful control over online harassment? And then he goes on. Making a comment about harassment being the oldest human strategy to counter whoever. Online harassment is out of control creature, given the size of the social media landscape. And also in this vein, Julia Haas from the OSCE. I'd like to ask a follow-up question in the content moderation. While there are indeed various challenges with social media platforms policing speech for using automated and reliable tools, so how news outlets moderate their own comment sections? And this is kind of a great and open, question, because we have paywall subscriber and subscriber registration automated manually. So let's open the floor for the three of you. Please jump in, feel free.
Can I start in the abstract and then actually have the two people who have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis tell me what they think if it works?
Sure.
So I was pretty impressed by what the Wall Street Journal did, I think it was last year. They did several things and they made it very, very public. They wrote about it publicly. They, first of all, drafted very clear community guidelines and posted them very visibly wherever people are going to comment on anything, which I have always thought was a very, very good practice. And there's some kind of a couple studies out of universities actually backing that up. Then they limited who could comment only to their paid subscribers. And then they limited how many articles would allow for commenting. And then they actually moderated those like aggressively according to their own guidelines. I'm sure it was sometimes thorny, you know, what stayed, what went. And the other thing that I've seen a lot of newsrooms do, often bigger ones, and I think the New York Times was one of the pioneers of this, is actually work with machine learning algorithms. So, well, not algorithms, machine learning systems like Perspective or Coral Project or others, which essentially help human content moderators deal with the volume and the kind of workload. So these systems, if you plug them into your comment moderation, will put toxic content in a holding area, a kind of quarantine for a human content moderator to decide, is this actually toxic? Is it a false positive? And then either put it onto the platform or keep it off. And so I just wanted to hear Sofia and Jason, and Javier, you too, because you've done a lot of this work too, kind of respond. You know, do you think that stuff is good? Do you think it works? Have you seen it gone awry? I'm super curious.
I mean, I can give the cheap answer, or sort of the quick one, which is it's very easy to do when you have a paid subscriber base, and that's who they're limited to commenting. So the New York Times is not a model that I think many others can follow unless you have a large paid subscriber base. We do not have the ability to moderate. Well, off-platform moderation is, I know, a whole other thing, which we get into, but for our on-platform moderation, it's just like you said. And frankly, even though we have all of these tools to help identify toxicity, there's a much lower level of toxicity because frankly, if you're going to spend $100 or whatever dollars a year to subscribe to the New York Times, like you're probably not the kind of person that's going to be a toxic commenter. And so like they just don't show up. So frankly, we have a team and they do it. And you know, comments certainly get flagged and you don't have to be a paying subscriber. You just have to be registered. You just have to create a free registration, but just that hurdle tends to block the vast majority. And so our task of moderating is actually much, much easier. So so if folks want to get like an idea or a vision, it's like if you have YouTube comments on like this side, right? And then like of the worst and like sort of the Wild West, we don't really have to struggle that much to moderate our comments. We do it, but we rarely see that much toxicity. And that's because we have this much more closed world that we're doing it in.
What do you think about reducing the number of articles that have
we do that
moderation
too.
So that you can actually moderate those as opposed to letting them be the Wild West?
We do that also. We have a big enough team that it's the reverse. It's that certain articles on certain topics we'll turn off comments if we have a fear that they might lead into mostly we're worried about misinformation. So it actually shows up a lot on COVID-19 stuff. We were really concerned that people would, you know, throw around these anecdotes being like, oh, the mask, I can't breathe. My cousin told me that if I took hydroxychloroquine, I'd be okay. And so we didn't want to have to deal with a lot of that kind of issues. And so it was easier to make those decisions.
For the off-platform, the not cheap and easy answer. So 100% for the on-platform, I've seen it's not just the Times, it's the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. German newspapers also have exactly the same approach, which is only certain articles will have comments on, and those get heavily moderated, and often moderators are actually trying to foster conversation. We see that working really well. I know, for example, in Germany, that the Süddeutsche has a huge team and they pick like 1 or 2 articles a day just to make sure that it gets moderated properly. Machine learning systems is something that I've heard a lot from the US, but I've not seen used widely in Europe. As someone who did study natural language processing and machine learning, I can only imagine that if well trained, these systems can facilitate immensely. So for all the on-platform stuff, 100% behind the cheap and easy answer. Off-platform and on social, which is actually what I've done the most, it's very difficult. So I do think it's possible. I do think you can set up a list of blocked words and automated hiding on Twitter, blocked words for Facebook, where basically any comment on that page that has certain types of words will be immediately hidden from the comments. So that helps a lot. The moderators can still look at the comments if they want to, but they won't be visible on the page. That helps. It's not a silver bullet. Especially because social media trolls are very, very smart and very, very capable of writing around these blocks, and this happens. But these lists certainly help. And I think that human moderation is absolutely necessary if this is something that you are investing in and your social media platforms are important to you. Now, I don't know that many media outlets that do heavy moderation. I know that we did it at Deutsche Welle. I haven't been at Politico long enough to discuss that because it's still in the implementation stage. I know the BBC does it. It's flawed. I personally am going to pivot back to the beginning to what Viktorya was saying in more of my ideal world. I personally believe that comment moderation and moderation generally, but comment moderation, content moderation are the big hidden features that social media companies want users never to think about, but they're actually the ones that get swept under the rug all the time and shouldn't. And those are the ones where we should hold these people's feet to the fire for not spending more time on them, for not having the people that are doing them feedbacking into the system more thoroughly about what kind of stuff and what kind of patterns they see. Do I think it's possible with the technology that we have? Yes. Do I think news media can do it alone? Absolutely not. Do I think that Facebook, Twitter, Google listen to us when we give them feedback about what they should do differently about comment moderation? I can most certainly tell you I have no evidence of that ever happening. And I've been to a lot of meetings in all of those buildings. So that's where we are.
Yeah, I think that one of the key issues here it's to have first of all like a very clear community guidelines, right? Sort of an etiquette, as is also known, this sort of document here in Europe, which but first of all to have them, but also to communicate them effectively. So to communicate to the user, so the user constantly know and is aware of what sort of what a speech is allowed, in the comment and what is not, and also to communicate with sort of let's say penalties these user might encounter, even if it's a paying user, because we've talked to some newsrooms in which what they have is sort of a so once yeah, sort of I mean, I don't want to say like penalty, but like warning system, in the sense that if the user has breached the etiquette or community guidelines, once, well, maybe they get warning, this comment would be removed, and then they get a warning. But then when this user has repeatedly, even if again it's the paying user, then they get like a 1 month blocked, or 1 week they're blocked from commenting, and then they get 1 month, and then after third or fourth warning they actually get expelled out, right, from the comment section. So I think that yeah, like and also yeah, I was thinking about now that there's this this experience from a news organization in Spain, where they have this also machine learning system in place, where they assigned sort of karma to each one of the users, right? So kind of each user would have, let's say, like a track record of their comments, in the sense that if one user would have been warned, or the comment of this user had been blocked for, I don't know, 3 or 4 times, then these comments would be the same comment, the comment from the same user would be automatically flagged for review, not for block, but for review, right? So there's all these different systems, and I think that Viktorya also mentioned here that the Coral project, right? And the system that they're putting in place with Talk as well. I think that those are also an interesting resource to look at. I think that we're reaching like the end of this webinar. Only 5 minutes left.
Questions.
Yes, there is this question from, hold on, from Nina Binquist. I hope I'm pronouncing it as well. I think that Jason has already replied to it, but maybe if both Viktorya and Sofia wants to weigh in, who gets to choose which articles will be commented, you know, how difficult it can be. Sofia?
I mean, we didn't do that, but so I think Jason might be the best person to talk to that. When we decided to remove our comment function, we disabled it altogether. So I would imagine it would be one of the audience editors, but I'll let Jason answer that one.
That's it. Yeah, there's an audience team. There's a social team that does that.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, if a reporter said, "Oh, can you please turn them off" or something, of course we would probably do it.
Mm-hmm. No, because there is a very interesting question here from Sofia Rusin, how to protect yourself from online harassment if you're a freelance journalist and you're only starting and you are starting your own news platform online as well. And the other one about Ana Velasquez, what do you think about counter-speech strategies as a response to abusive content or as a way to empower people experiencing attacks? It's an open question to the three of you. Maybe we can start with freelance.
Those are huge questions for 3 minutes left.
I know. But let's go over time. It doesn't matter.
I'm going to cheat.
I'm going to cheat a little. Really good. Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm going to cheat a little, and for the question for Sofia, and I mean this earnestly. If you look at the 2 links that we shared at the top of the chat, there's a very good link from On the Line on freelancers, kind of coping strategies for freelancers. And take a look at our online harassment field manual. There is a lot of very, very concrete, good guidance, very carefully organized about coping mechanisms for online harassment: preparation, response, self-care, support. Only because if I tried to summarize those things now, we'd be here for another 20 minutes. But if you take a quick peek at those and you have specific questions, I'm happy to share my email and talk to you. For counter speech, I have thoughts. They're different from other people's thoughts. My main point about counter speech that I make over and over and over again, and Jason, you do or don't have to respond, because I know we always have slightly different ideas about this, because you deal with this every day and I get to deal with it from the outside, from the abstract, so it's a bit easier for me, is that you can practice counter speech without confronting an abuser, right? There are ways to, and I think this is as true for individuals as it is for newsrooms. I absolutely agree with the old adage about feeding the trolls, that getting into retaliatory back and forth conversations with trolls as an institution or an individual almost always backfires. And the reason it backfires is because a lot of times what the trolls want, what the abusive trolls want, is to goad you into saying something abusive back and then to use that to try to get you fired. So absolutely, I 100% agree that getting into yelling matches with an abusive troll is a bad idea. But there are other ways of practicing counter speech at the individual level. That can look like, GIFs and memes, like K-pop fans flood, GIFs and memes to turn something upside down, to reclaim a hashtag. That is an incredibly powerful, effective, non-violent tool. But I think institutions they rarely do, but they can issue a statement against harassment, against hate, in support of an individual journalist, or just on the issue generally, which is also an effective form of counter speech, which has nothing to do with getting into a yelling match with a troll.
I mean, I support this. I think it's a very fine line to thread, and I think it's very difficult because there's a limit at which it is useful, right? And beneath a certain level, it is feeding the trolls, and you shouldn't feed the trolls. But in our accounts, we kind of took to doing certain things that, again, this is for newsrooms very tricky. So we only had senior staff doing this. So it was me, and then I trained someone else to do it, which would be, we knew we had some trolls that kept coming up on our page, and we blocked them, and they just kept coming back. Like variations of the same name, of the same picture, no matter how many times we blocked those accounts, they would keep coming back. And at some point we just acknowledged them very politely in our chats as the company, right? And we kind of went without making fun of them, without making fun of anything or undermining any of the issues that they were pointing out. We'd be like, nice to see you again here. Tom, I think, was the alias that he used. I'm pretty sure that wasn't his name. And after a while, I think our users, the user base, realized that we were flagging to them, like, maybe this person is someone that you shouldn't take too seriously. Because he always commented with the same picture, same time, same types of articles that we knew. We had a pattern, we blocked them over and over again. It kept coming back. And at some point we just decided to engage. I think that for counter speech, you have to be very careful and you have to assess it really well. And I think, again, it all goes back to how we started, which is how much you have actually in terms of space, but also means to spend time on this, because this will require a lot of time and effort. So I would say that if you don't have the sort of support and time for it, maybe the best way is to not engage, not externally anyways, always internally. There was also a question that I wanted to flag that was in the comments. It was like, COVID has made everything more difficult. And so be kind to whomever you may know doing this, because there's a ridiculous amount of disinformation and misinformation and all sorts of wildfire like theories and ideas spreading on platform and especially off platform about COVID and what it means and what it does and what it doesn't do. So I think COVID is just like, I call it the extra 30% on top of the usual everything.
Yeah, these are all very accurate, and if there's one piece that I would agree that kind of ties between all three of us, it's that you shouldn't get into counter speech unless you really think that you know what you're doing and you feel like you have some expertise in this, and you definitely shouldn't do it like as a emotional. Counter speech is a tactic, and tactics need to be tied to strategy, right? Like there needs to be thought behind it. And so if you're going to do it, make sure that you know what you're doing. And the other part that kind of, I think maybe it's come up in a few of the questions here before, is a word that we use a lot in our company is something in good faith or in bad faith, right? Are you arguing with a person who actually is interested in exchanging ideas? Or usually when we say the word troll, we mean someone who's bad faith, who's attacking, and they're never going to change their mind, or they're never going to, so I think that that's a helpful check, right? Which is there someone to talk to here? And, I think we saw this example here that I'm going to read in a bit about like people meeting their trolls and blah, blah, blah. And like, the reformed troll, that is so rare. The vast majority are, and these are people who are hurt, no need to get into the psychology of why they do these things, but but they're not operating under the same playbook of logic, reason, and like Platonic ideas that the rest of us are. So I just really stress that counter speech is effective for the third person. So it's not effective for the troll. You're never going to get the troll to change what they're doing. But then there's other people who are watching the exchange happen. And the counter speech is most effective when it's written, right, to say like, well, we stand behind this person. So everyone else who's watching this exchange should recognize that like, we don't accept this as right. And we're not going to validate the troll by even responding to the specific claim. So we wouldn't say, for example, if the troll says, give some horrific racial abuse about somebody and or sexual violence, the answer isn't, well, no, they're wrong. Like that's not the point. The point is to say, we stand behind this journalist is an incredible journalist who has difficult work, and this is the cost of good journalism. And the fact that it makes these people upset maybe is worth exploring. Like, what are they protecting? What are they trying to, so you're actually kind of pushing the story further along, right? So a version of counter speech that's been effective in the past is to say, well, if this is how they're responding to our journalism, what does this tell us? Maybe we're really onto something, right? And so there's the thing I would just say about counter speech is you never want to go directly right at, you're not rebutting in a debate what people say, you're supporting a person. And those are two separate ideas.
So I think that we need to wrap up at this point. And well, thank you very much to three of you to for joining and for sharing light into the many areas and questions. Like I'm sure that we have a lot of things to add to what we the different areas where we wanted to talk, and one of them that I just took a note for a potential new webinar in the coming weeks is what has been the impact of online harassment on journalists during the pandemic, especially those working in isolated environments from their houses, etc. So without this sort of support network around them, like they can be like colleagues or editors and journalists. So I think that that's an interesting point as well. So we're wrapping up. Thank you very much to all the participants. Has been great. The chat, I could see that was super lively. So please I saw that there's notes there with emails back and forth. So that's absolutely great.